In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and all you Sublators out there. It's I, Douglas Lain, the host of Sublation Magazine, author of short stories such as The Sea Monkey Conspiracy, filmmaker extraordinaire, making the guy behind the last election. With me today is Benjamin Studebaker and Nina Power. Benjamin, you want to introduce yourself first?
Yep, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
And Nina?
Gosh, I'm Nina Power. I'm a writer also. I have written a book a while ago now on masculinity called What Do Men Want? And a long time ago, a book called One-Dimensional Women. What was it even called? Which was a critique of what I perceived to be consumerism and liberal feminism at that time, which was now more than 20 years ago.
No.
Well, it came out in 2009, but it was actually written like 2004 or 2005. So.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Terrifying.
Well, yes, I know. Because I think of that as a contemporary critique of contemporary feminism. And
it might still be relevant in some ways.
Yeah. All right. Well, today we usually cover topical news items on the Sublation Magazine show. But today I wanted to talk about Ernest Becker and Ernest Hemingway. We're going to be talking about The Denial of Death and a short story called A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. Just to start with, I want to introduce who Ernest Becker was. He was a sociologist, I believe, and he won the Nobel Prize posthumously for his book, The Denial of Death. He'd written a few other books, including Escape from Evil. He was actually, I'm sorry, not a sociologist, but a cultural anthropologist. He wrote The Denial of Death. It became a success, and then he died of cancer almost immediately, I think at the age of, in his 40s. The Denial of Death is a very interesting book because it posits that rather than the sex drive being the primary problem for humanity, or some other psychological or religious difficulty being what's central to the human experience, he posits that death and our inability to adequately comprehend and accept our mortality is the primary difficulty of the human experience, and is also behind most social ills and political conflicts. He has this notion that because of our fear of death, we take up heroic projects that are identified, or that we then identify with the culture through. So we'll share a heroic project with other people of our nationality or our tribe or what have you. And then when we encounter other hero projects, we feel threatened, and this leads to social and political conflict. So those are that's the nutshell version of Ernest Becker. You've been, and Nina, you're somewhat familiar with Becker. Have I done an okay job in summarizing him?
Yes, I'll absolutely take your position. It seems quite Hobbesian in a way, perhaps, or Hobbesian, as Benjamin says.
Well, I'm interested to hear why you would say that. I mean, I guess I can try to intuit a connection, but I hadn't thought of that before. So
I suppose, I mean, perhaps only in the sense initially that for Hobbes in Leviathan, which is extraordinarily brilliant text. I mean, I recommend everybody read it, whatever you end up thinking about it. It would be something like the claim that indeed beneath all of our desires and quests is the thing that unites us is our fear of death, and indeed a state that is predicated on this realization is one way of organizing politics, and perhaps the best one, insofar as having a strong state or the sovereign that basically protects us as insofar as that's possible. We give up our natural right in order for state protection, but basically that without some way of the state or politics addressing this fundamental fear of death that unites us, we won't get anything done, basically. I mean, I personally am much more of the Spinozist inclination. I'm just going to read you this great quote from Spinoza, where he says, "A free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not of death, but of life." I personally am totally fine with finitude. I think I see it as a natural fact. Indeed, many philosophers make this point. It is something that is necessary. But I do think the attempt to avoid it, in Becker's sense, does indeed lead to these quests for immortality, which ultimately can lead to evil, right? That competing projects of immortality, such as, well, transhumanism would be one, but the quest for immortality is as old as man himself, right? The idea that we can escape our finitude is a very powerful desire, right?
Yeah, I want to let Ben speak. So, Ben, do you want to add something here? Maybe on the
Makes me think
Hobbesian
of,
point?
I have a couple of thoughts. One is the strongest critique of Hobbes is always the claim that the fear of death is not as important as Hobbes thinks it is. The fear of death causes us to seek peace, and therefore causes us to come together to have commodious living. It's the fact that some people are not as scared of death as Hobbes suggests that causes that argument to not go through. And sometimes with undergraduate students, I would refer to all of mankind on a Hobbes-Gandhi scale or spectrum with regard to what degree fear should motivate us versus positive commitments to values. In the Becker book, all of the positive commitments to values are reframed as sublimated fear of death. And I have noticed that there's a tendency, and I've always thought it's a little adolescent. It's something that people tend to do when they're teenagers or in their 20s, of going, okay, I have this vice or problem or hang up. I'm going to project it onto everybody. Mm-hmm. Everybody actually has this. So therefore, I don't have to get rid of it because it's in everybody. And since it's in everybody, anybody who claims that they don't have it or seems to not have it has just covered it up in a bunch of pride. And I can then expose them as having concealed this thing that, of course, they necessarily inevitably must have. Because I have it. And I am the universal subject. Well,
this is the one where this is the episode where Doug ends up defending the person he wanted to critique, because I hear what you're saying, Ben, but I do think to reduce Becker's argument to an attempt to universalize his own particular neurosis sidesteps the main point of his book. I mean, because he isn't making the argument that the fear of death can keep people in line or bring people together for peace, but quite the opposite, that it's our bids for immortality by investing in projects beyond ourselves, whether those projects are...
This is what makes him much more adolescent than Hobbes.
Okay.
So Hobbes will say that some people are not sufficiently concerned with the fear of death. And they instead formulate religious views and develop conceptualizations of God and what God wants of them. And then they kill each other and die on the basis of these conceptualizations. And that this is crazy behavior. This is crazy. Becker will redescribe everything everybody does until it fits with this theory, in the way that, say, a kid who's discovered psychological egoism or relativism will redescribe everything in life to make it fit a prefabricated notion of what motivates people psychologically. And that is, to me, what made, Hobbes is a genius. Hobbes is one of the great minds of human history.
Mm-hmm.
Becker is not.
Well, I'm not going to dispute which of these writers is the greater writer or had more of an influence on human history. Obviously, I would lose that argument if I were to try to go after Hobbes. But leaving Hobbes alone, like not trying to discredit Hobbes, I do think it's worthwhile to understand Ernest Becker beyond the pejorative of adolescent and say, okay, what was his theory of cultural anthropology? And because it was not merely a theory of how people cover up their neurosis individually, but he was saying something about why civilizations exist, why cultural projects come together, what they're addressing. And he was saying, most civilizational projects are attempts to create the sense of something immortal that then individuals can participate in.
Yeah, but this reduces the many different reasons and many different motivations that drive these projects to just one thing.
Yeah, sure. Any theory, though, like this is often going to be accused of being reductive.
Instrumentalizing. It takes human values and treats them as actually having an instrumental character rather than having intrinsic meaningfulness. So it therefore has a nihilistic implication.
There is certainly a nihilistic implication. I'm not sure that the reductive quality of it is what gives it that nihilistic implication.
Well, if he claimed that just some people have this problem and that this is one of the motivations that causes people to get involved with projects, and that when this motivation is the dominant motivation driving a project, that causes trouble, it would be a much more interesting argument. But he can't content himself with this. He instead pridefully makes grandiose claims that go far beyond that.
Well, I just don't attribute this to pride. I do think that it is a fact that we all are mortal and that we all long for something that will go beyond ourselves. My phone's ringing all of a sudden. And that we participate in projects that we think are larger than we are.
I mean, to take Becker seriously, and I do think we should, I mean, to entertain speculatively what is being claimed, right? One way of avoiding immortality, sort of embracing immortality, I should say, is the having of children, right? This is an obvious way in which people continue their line that they someone in the comments, Newman Nautical is talking about the fact that we're part of this great chain of being. And one way to address this, if we take Becker's claim seriously, is to say, well, okay, here are some usual ways that people deal with this, right? Having children would be a really obvious one. And indeed, I do think that this is a way that some people then think, well, okay, I've participated and I have children and maybe they'll have children, and that we're all part of this big chain of being, and that being is good first and foremost, that expanding consciousness, expanding human being is a good project, and so on. I think obviously we're in an interesting moment in which there is a bottleneck around demographics and population, and many, many more people are not having children across the world. And there's all kinds of discussions about this. Oh, can we blame feminism? Do we blame technology? And so on and so forth. I think the causes are much deeper. The roots are much more profound. They might even be sort of mysterious at the kind of collective human level. There's also lots of reasons why human beings are living longer, or babies that, for example, would have died are now surviving. We can keep people alive through developments in medical technology. I do think there is an interesting comment that relates, perhaps we can extend Becker's thesis perhaps into what happened around COVID and the lockdowns, and perhaps the fear of particular generations. I do strongly sometimes get the sense that the boomer generation, the older generation, do have a fear of death, and they can't, some of them can't really imagine a world without them. if you like, and that sometimes there's this clinging on to existence for as long as possible. Although this is going alongside like the MAID project in Canada and in Britain, also the increasing proposed legislation around suicide, to decriminalize it, and indeed to make it possible for the state to kill people if they decide that they no longer want to live for whatever reason. And so there is a fear of death, right? There is clearly this question of a crisis, let's say, in the West around what death is. We also don't live proximate to death in the way that our ancestors would have done. More of us survive. We don't encounter death. It has become medicalized and hygienized and put us away in care homes, and we are distanced from it in a way that is perhaps very unhelpful and unrealistic. And Ivan Illich makes this point very much in Medical Nemesis and so on and so forth, that actually we have stopped thinking that death is a natural fact that should encourage us to think about virtue and think about our life and think about how we are in life, but rather that we become anxious about death, and that actually the very things that are supposed to help us live are not actually thick enough. They're not rich enough. They don't contain value in the way that we might want, but merely reflect this kind of fear. So I think there is something about this moment, or the last 50 years or so, or the West, or the 20th century, and this fear of death and what it has led to, right?
Yeah, which made this book catch on. And once you frame this as a problem, something that is symptomatic of our times, that many people are making many decisions for this kind of reason, then it becomes a much more interesting thing to talk about. When it's the problem and you try to explain everything that's ever existed transhistorically in terms of this, it becomes way too much. But if it just becomes one of the things that's going on, and why is it that that he won a Nobel Prize? And why is it that Bill Clinton says that this is one of his favorite books that he's ever read? Now we're getting into something that I think is more interesting, which is why are these kinds of reasons so common now, and do seem to drive a lot of behavior now, such that this book would be praised to the degree that it was. And I think that the Nina point about family, of course, this is one of the reasons you could have a family, but it's not the best reason to have one. And parents who are parents for this reason, because they wanted to extend themselves, are not the best parents. If you could choose parents who had kids for this kind of reason versus other kinds of reasons people have for having children, you would not pick parents who had kids for this kind of reason. But Becker will insist that whenever people have children, they have them only for this reason and for no other reason but this reason. And so what it does is it lowers and reduces and devalues all of the other reasons people have for having families.
Well, I haven't read the book recently, but I encountered the denial of death in the early 90s. It's actually featured in Annie Hall. There's a bookstore together, and he keeps giving her books with death in the title. And she complains about this. She wants to buy a book about cats. But anyway, it's Denial of Death is one of the books that he hands her. So I read it, and it spoke to me in the early 90s. I didn't think he was explaining all human behavior this way.
Civilization. Explaining civilization with this. That's too big a claim.
I don't disagree that it might be wrong. I just don't think he was simply universalizing his own private neurosis. I do think something...
Not even just one type of civilization, but civilization as such.
Yeah, I understand. But I wouldn't say that he was universalizing his own private neurosis. I think he was being transhistorical, but I don't think that he was simply acting out of some individual quirk and out of pride.
Yeah, not necessarily. It might not be a psychological thing. It might just be a mistake.
Well,
but often mistakes come out of these things. See, one could make a different kind of argument that says that when people make transhistorical claims, that this comes from pride generally, right? And one could say every time anybody makes a transhistorical claim, it comes out of pride. because pride drives all of human behavior. And one could write a book that frames everything everybody does in terms of that. And it might not be the case that it was one's own pride or one's own fixation on status that drove one to do that. But also that could be the motivation that causes somebody to write such. It's one of the possibilities.
Sure. But
why would you write a book like this?
Well, let's explore another one. There's
Wait, before we do, can I just make a comment about the Annie Hall thing and the looking at the books about death? Because I think this is an old and tried tactic, right? We have this great poem from about the 1680s by Andrew Marvell called To His Coy Mistress, in which the narrator of the poem is constantly reminding the woman with whom he wants to have sex that she will die, and she might as well have sex with him because before she dies, before everything becomes worm meat. And I think there is this sort of Eros Thanatos thing. Of course there is, right? Like that one can mobilize this sort of I don't know, the sort of tragic sense of finitude in order to
you
turn
only live once.
What?
Yeah. YOLO.
Exactly, YOLO. So I think that's what's going on with the Annie Hall seduction scene.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, but in the movie, which I know fairly well, they have already become a couple.
Yeah.
And at this point, he's encouraging her to take college classes and trying to broaden her. So it's not so much that he's trying to seduce her, but rather he wants her to be a deeper thinker. And so
okay, but I think sort of like by focusing on Thanatos and death, it's also like an erotic play, right?
Sure. I'll grant you.
A couple of lines in the Marvell just to demonstrate this is a very old and tried and true tactic. You know, he says, "Time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust," and so on, right? He's very much trying to say, like, you know, do it.
Tries to generate cowardice, tries to generate fear to get somebody to do something.
Yeah. It's very beautiful. It's a very lovely poem, right?
Right. Well, I wanted to go back a step, and we can go back to this sex and death combination. I think Woody Allen made another movie called Love and Death. We could talk about that one, but I wanted to talk about an alternative explanation as to why Becker, although I don't think his theory ultimately is adequate, is certainly not the most interesting cultural anthropology that I've ever encountered. I think it's worthy of being read. You know, I don't regret having read it in my youth, but I want to posit an alternative reason that the problem of death loomed larger in 1973 than it had in the past, and that it was conceived of differently as a different kind of problem. And I'm going to quote from Rick Roderick, a Rick Roderick lecture that he gave back in the 90s. He says he wanted to put forward a kind of modern myth that had replaced the myth of Christianity. And he was paraphrasing or trying to gloss Nietzsche as he put forward this modern myth. And it is this: there are billions and billions of stars. The earth is a tiny speck. We crawl across it for just a few seconds, and then we individually are gone, and billions of eons of time before and billions after pass, and the earth eventually goes out like a cinder, and perhaps the whole universe collapses into itself. And after all that has happened, absolutely nothing will have been done. Now, that's a very important myth. Many of us believe that one too, but against that background, it becomes difficult as we chip away at our daily little lives, selling shoes, selling tires, teaching class, to try to make any damn thing that means anything. So that is the secular but scientific cosmological.
The assault on the present moment.
Right. The assault on the present moment by considering it in the full context of a story or a myth that is essentially nihilistic.
By suggesting that the present moment has to answer to something outside itself, that the present moment isn't sufficient.
Mm. But I mean, in a reading of that, you know, let's say the sort of materialist scientific worldview, right, in which the heat death of the universe is a real fact, and how do we live in the light of that? I mean, I think it's not clear, because I think it can go one of two ways, right? Why either one can say, oh well, actually that's amazing and beautiful, and the very fact that we have any experience and consciousness at all is incredible, and what an honor it is to even be alive and have the gift of life, and so on. And the other of which is perhaps the nihilistic conclusion, right? Like, so, well, in the light of this, nothing we do really matters. Do you see what I mean? Like, it doesn't necessarily tell you how that framing will go in terms of how
it's
people...
compelling to some people because of their pragmatism. If there's kind of an assumption that everything has to have some further purpose, nothing can be sufficient in itself, then the fact that if you could take this all the way forward, you get the heat death of the universe or the big chill or whatever, seems to render pragmatism inert as a legitimate motivating basis for taking decisions and living life. And so the more that you live and behave and operate in a pragmatic way, the more that kind of story will seem to make things meaningless to you.
I am just not, I mean, I am not quite convinced. I think the problem is I don't quite understand how to escape the thought that for something to be meaningful, it has to have a purpose beyond itself. I think that for me, that's sort of baked in, and I want to question it. So would you help me question that assumption a little bit more? Like, for instance, if I want to lead a virtuous life, then it seems to me as though there's something beyond my life itself that is virtue, that I am acting out my life in service of. But
virtue might also be its own reward, in the famous phrase, right?
Virtue is there in each thing that you do. A virtuous life, virtue is in the life. It's not external to the life. It's in the life. It's immanent to it.
Okay. Yes. Right. But it does seem to me at the same time to be conceptual in a way that even as it's immanent, it also transcends the particular instantiations of it.
So if you were trying to get at what is God, what is the good, what is virtue in itself, then we would be talking about something that we can't talk about. If we say that we have to explain that in terms of something else, then it no longer is the thing that it is.
Mm-hmm.
So then it just becomes a question of, can we have something like that in our conceptual scheme, or is that an illicit move? And the concept of faith is the concept that you can have something like that in your conceptual scheme without having to further justify it or to explain it in terms of something else. And if you don't have faith, then you don't believe that you can have something like that in your conceptual scheme. And then everything has to be instrumentalized on some level, because everything requires an explanation in terms of something else.
Right. So, yeah, this is the problem of faith. How to have faith when the faith isn't socially or culturally or politically given. That when the individual is tasked with choosing a faith, rather than being brought up within it. I think that's what Becker is actually ultimately speaking to, and it comes up for him as the problem of death, but it could be another problem. But because it's worth noting that Becker's solution, the one he has the most confidence in, is a return to Christianity. specifically, I think, or religion in any case. But if I remember correctly, he was kind of advocating for Christianity, but in a threadbare way, in a way where it was a pragmatic decision one would make in terms of how trying to create a better liberal democratic
Yeah, but that doesn't
society.
do it. That's
No,
why
you can't.
Adorno in
You
Negative
can't do it.
Dialectic says, at the point at which the metaphysician justifies it in terms of it would be good for people to believe it.
Yeah, right. I mean, it that was always hollow to me.
Right. Once it's reduced to a pragmatic claim, it's no longer the thing. So once you say, well, it would be useful if people were Christian, they can't be. Not on the basis of that, at least.
I mean, I think, Pascal's wager looms its head here. And I think one thing that's interesting to note about that is that it was apparently a joke to some of his friends. Like, he wrote it as because friends of his were making these kind of game theoretical arguments that it would be, let's say, more useful or a good thing to be Christian because of the possible ends, right? That and Pascal's wager is, I suppose, one way of understanding it would be to say, well, even if Christianity is not true, you still live a better life, and it's still better to be Christian than not, right? And of course, putting it in this way is, as you saying, Benjamin's saying, is to sort of undermine what that would actually mean. But I think if we understand that Pascal was putting the argument in this way as a sort of provocation to his friends who were thinking in these utilitarian terms, then we can understand it better, maybe.
This is why the Protestants say sola fide.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you don't have the faith, no pragmatism will get you there.
Yeah. But even if you accept Pascal's wager, then it almost does say that pragmatism will be better, right? Because even if Christianity isn't true, you will have still lived a better life than the person who lived without belief, right? The person, let's say, who just pursued their hedonistic desires, who just did whatever they wanted, and so on and so forth. And I think the idea that basically, like, one is not punished for your sins but by them is quite a Pascalian thought in this respect. That there are indeed better and worse ways of living, right? And the better and worse things we can do to ourselves and to others. And I think,
but can you really sustain a religion off something like Pascal's wager?
No, you can't. But that's why I think it's a provocation for his friends who were already thinking in this utilitarian way. And I think it's I think Becker's book also only makes sense in the context of the inheritance of a Christian culture. The West is a Christian culture, whether you're Christian or not, whether you say individually, I believe X and Y, or whether you go to church or not, or whether you read the Bible. It's like, we are Christian, whether we like it or not. And all of our questions come from that framework. And I think this is a lot of the work that various post-liberals have done in order to try to say, for example, that actually even the questions that we pose against Christianity come from our Christian heritage, that they are peculiar and specific to the West, as are our values and virtues in a secular sense, right? So human rights, for example, would derive from Christian values. That we can't escape that history. We are indeed formed by it, regardless of how we might individually describe our own worldview. Do you see what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I definitely think that it's true that a lot of our liberal values derive from the history of Christianity. But I also think it's true that the question of faith is a vexing one, even in a Christianized culture today. I think Christianity itself, I mean, the Strange Death of American Exceptionalism, which we published last year, explores this process of secularization through Christianity and through great awakenings and so forth. So I do think that the problem of faith is key to understanding the popularity of Ernest Becker. So it's not that he's being prideful. He may be blind to some degree to the failures of his own argument. For instance, the way in which he pragmatically suggests that we take on Christianity.
We're not always conscious of our pride. There are certain kinds of arguments that a humble person just doesn't make. And this is that kind of argument. It has a grandiosity to it that is incompatible with humility.
But can there not be like a speculative grandiosity? You know, when you try something out, it's like, I'm going to assert this, and then we can see where it goes and if it works, right?
Well,
there's playfulness. There's kind of, a ludus sort of a ludic mood that you can be in. But then there's writing it as a sociologist and trying to get a Nobel Prize for it. And that's a different, I think. I don't think it was ludic. I don't think that was the motivation.
In Becker's
But
defense,
it could be in principle.
In Becker's defense, he was dead when he got the Nobel Prize, and I don't know the degree to which he campaigned for it. But
to do it as an anthropologist, to do it as a social scientist, seems to me to make it unlikely that it was done in a ludic mood.
Well, I don't think it was ludic. No, the topic and his approach to it was not ludic. But I would just say again that. Okay, perhaps there was some sort of pride, but if it was pride, it wasn't personal. If there was a pride, it might be similar to
epistemic.
The kind of pride, right? But it might be, but not a personal epistemology. It might be tied to the kind of pride that Faust had, which you could attach to the scientific modern project as a whole, the abandonment of faith, socially and historically, rather than simply as a matter of some personal individual fault in Becker.
I mean, it's certainly true that in the 20th century and even before, really, I mean, with the rise of Darwinism, the success of the sciences, Nietzsche's diagnosis of the death of God, I mean, the world wars, the Holocaust, the way in which, the crisis of meaning is very much part of the 20th century. And then, of course, you have existentialism, you have Heidegger's attempt to talk about the generation of meaning through the project and this idea of authenticity and what it is for man to make meaning, right, through our projects. And these are all responses to this crisis, right? The crisis of faith in religious belief, the idea that some things have happened in modernity that are so catastrophic that to blithely carry on as a Christian would be impossible or extremely difficult. How can God allow these things to happen, and so on and so forth? So there is a real crisis. There is a real response that Nietzsche diagnoses a lot earlier than Becker, right? Like that there is a problem. There is a culture-wide problem, even if we accept what I've said about the history, that the framing is still Christian, even when people are struggling with Christianity. And if we take like Kierkegaard, he mentions Kierkegaard's struggle with faith, that actually to be a Christian is not simply to assert once and for all, oh, I believe in God and so on, and that Christ died for our sins and was resurrected. And it's not, that doesn't solve your problem, right? It doesn't solve the difficulty of faith. It doesn't solve the difficulty of living as a Christian and so on and so forth. So that kind of struggle becomes a feature. The struggle towards meaning and redemption and all those things becomes a feature then of 20th century thought, even when people are Kierkegaardian whilst also being explicitly atheist. So obviously the existentialists such as Sartre will say, oh, well, simply saying God provides meaning is itself a form of bad faith, paradoxically, that faith becomes a form of bad faith because you're not then making meaning yourself, right?
Ben,
the principle is being asked to provide meaning. It's being asked to do something instrumental.
Right, but there is a crisis. I mean, is there not? I mean, the 20th century is filled with the horrific and really pointless murder of millions of young men in 2 world wars, right? For what? You could absolutely understand a thoughtful, reflective 20th century thinker, playwright, whatever, saying, well, what does this all mean? What was this all for? How can God have permitted this and so on? The perennial problem.
It's in part a consequence of the pride that the fall is experienced that way. when you have widespread belief that certain things had been overcome or were no longer problems or weren't going to be issues going forward, and then all of a sudden you're confronted with these things again with all of the horrific quality of industrial super weapons, that is going to make it very hard to process those events. When the Mongols come and burn down Baghdad, there is a framework in which an event like that can be processed at the time at which it occurs. Events like that are not unheard of, even if that one is worse. But in the 20th century, there was a hubris that we had gone beyond the world wars, that we were not the kinds of people who would or could do those kinds of things. And then we discovered all of a sudden that that wasn't true. So the pride contributed to the existential crisis.
When in earlier times, in pre-modern times, when thousands of people would be killed in one go, what kind of rituals were there to honor the dead? Because one of the things that I've learned in my patchwork, studies of history, is that after the Civil War, one of the major social ills was felt to be the way in which so many died anonymously and were buried in mass graves and not remembered or honored in any way. And that since then, there was an effort by the military to, spend and create programs so that when soldiers died, they were in some way remembered officially by the state. And so I'm just wondering, how was it done?
Yeah, there's a kind of peculiar modern emphasis on remembering every specific person and having the state do it and make lists of names and put lists of names on monuments.
Yeah.
In the Middle Ages or in antiquity, the Mongols make a giant pyramid of skulls. And the skulls, who knows who they belong to? Nobody knows. There's no data. There's no way of processing that. Particular relatives of somebody might feel a sense of obligation to that person to try to do something if they can. But a lot of the time, you just wouldn't be able to do very much of anything because the body would have been destroyed or put into, oftentimes the body would be used by the conqueror to send a sign or to send a message. So you wouldn't get the body. You wouldn't have an opportunity to honor it. It would be taken by the conqueror and used as an instrument of the conquest, loaded up with disease and chucked over a wall, or the head put on a spike and used to send a message. The idea that you or your family or the polity that you come from has property over the body that's inviolable is a very modern idea.
But I think it's actually a mark of civilization. I mean, when I think about the local war memorials in the UK, as we're coming up to Remembrance Sunday, actually these are a very profound markers of the sacrifice that was made by people and they're local. They were locally funded in many cases, right? It was the people came together to pay for the memorials with the names of the specific people who came from this particular area. And I think remembering the dead and knowing where our ancestors are buried actually is something that is eroded by a certain kind of modernity. Like, how many of us know where our ancestors are buried or would even be able to find out? Like, this is actually, we're cut off from our past in this way, in a way that I think is actually quite devastating to people when they think about it.
But there was also something not quite right about the ways in which, after the World Wars, an attempt was made to make it seem okay by sort of take the people who did the worst atrocities and take them to court like they committed crimes, bourgeois crimes. Take the people who died and make a wall that's got their names on them, or make a statue with the names on them. Or there was something about it that was an attempt to kind of reinscribe into modernity something that seemed profoundly in conflict with the modern notion of what we are. And I think that the not quite rightness of that has always been part of the picture.
I don't know about this. I think this was a genuine attempt to recognize sacrifice and the loss of people from particular places. And I mean,
Oh, it
somebody
was
in
an
the
attempt.
yeah, but I think a positive attempt, right? I think that to memorialize, to remember sacrifice is actually civilizing, is a civilized thing to do, and also recognition of the horror. And perhaps it's ambivalent, you know, it's not chauvinistic straightforwardly, right? I don't think that these are just reassertions of state power or something like that. I think they
But to reduce it to something that can be recognized is, I think, fundamentally to fail to recognize it. To make World War II something that you can commemorate is to necessarily trivialize it on some level.
You commemorate the sacrifice that people made, surely. Whatever you think about it, you know, these things happened. People died at scale. I don't know. I think memorializing the dead is something very fundamental to who we are, or the desire to memorialize, however poorly, however badly we do it. I mean, somebody in the chat mentions
people have different views about it.
Well,
like when my father died, there were profoundly different feelings about what was the appropriate thing to do. And
of course, but it wasn't nothing, was it? Right? People wanted to remember him, perhaps in different ways.
Well, I don't know. My own attitude has tended to be that attempting to distill it into something necessarily just makes it worse. You know, that funerals just make things worse. In my own case. But I know lots of other people don't approach it that way. I recognize we have different motivations and people process things in different ways. But in my own case, all of that stuff just seems to, you know, take something that can't be described in science and tries to put it into ordinary science.
But it doesn't exhaust the feeling. I mean, the ritual remembrance of the dead is for the living and to mark and to bring people together and so on. And in a way, it's about life. It's about those who survive. I mean, someone in the chat mentions Antigone as an ancient example of the very strong desire for Antigone to break the laws of the city in order to bury her brother. You know.
Yes, there could be a personal family tie or family reason.
But it raises the question.
Laws of the city are broken to do it.
Exactly. But because there's something more powerful and more important than the laws of the city in Antigone's case. And she's a hero, right? In this sense. And I mean, maybe the Becker question about the heroic is an interesting one. I mean, we arguably don't live in a very heroic age. Like, who can be a hero today? And perhaps people want to be a hero, but, you know, I mean, Alistair McIntyre and After Virtue would argue that we live in a post-heroic era. We live in the era of emotivism and managerialism and therapy and those sorts of things. I mean, the man who attempts to be a hero today is maybe laughed at, if it's even possible, right? In the grand
Don
scheme.
Quixote.
Right. I mean, but it is there. People, I mean, you might say, well, actually, to be heroic could also be, and perhaps more meaningfully, is to sacrifice oneself in whatever ways are necessary for one's family, for example, like the quiet, unsung heroes, right? Of the self-sacrificing person is heroic. You know, or in Britain, yesterday there was a horrible incident, and someone who worked for the train company, it looks like he tried very hard to stop this horrific thing happening by basically risking his own life and indeed probably, you know, being prepared to sacrifice his own life to stop somebody committing violence against other people. Like, he put his body in the way of other people, right? As a felt duty, clearly a spontaneous feeling of the need to protect others that he doesn't know. People act like this, often at cost of their own life, potentially, right? So what is death in this context? Like, what is the meaning of death or risking one's life if we do it to save others or to prevent harm? I don't know. So saying it in this very emotional way, but
Ernest Becker would say that when you sacrifice yourself for others, say throwing yourself in front of others and knowingly sacrificing yourself to keep them from harm, throwing yourself on the hand grenade. He would say you are doing that because you are invested in some sort of heroic immortality project.
That's what the psychological egoists say.
Yeah.
That's that debate that people have when they're 21.
Which is when I was reading and earlier when I was reading Becker. But let's grant it that might be true, because another way of saying that is you have faith in a virtue that goes beyond your need for survival, that you have faith that the sacrifice will be of value in and of itself, eminently, and beyond that, perhaps. I don't know. But let's talk a little bit. I'm really, look, I just had a memorial for my dad, which I organized and emceed. So I'm very tempted to talk about with you, Ben, about why you thought the funeral was a mistake. But let's do that quickly, and then we should talk about Ernest Hemingway a little bit and A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. But I'm not wanting to defend memorials or funerals after having organized one, nor do I want to condemn it. I don't really know how I stand, where I stand, or why. I know why I wanted to do one. And it became more important for me to have a memorial for him after I saw his body, because he was gone. It wasn't him anymore. It was barely recognizable. Even though he wasn't disfigured, particularly, he became like it was. I've said this lots of times, but it was like if you went to, let's say, Czechoslovakia, and they had a wax museum of American celebrities. They would maybe approximate, say, Kim Kardashian or Elvis Presley or someone, but it wouldn't be right. That was sort of the feeling I got. And I wanted to put together a memorial that I thought would capture at least some aspect of who he really was, rather than have him become a statistic or just be equated with the shell of what was left behind. But I don't know if that was my own immortality project that I was investing in, or, if I was being pragmatic or modern or what. And I'm not sure it was ultimately redeeming, but it was what motivated me. But you've also lost your father. What was it about your, if I can ask such a personal question, that about your father's funeral that you felt missed the target, or was a waste of time, or was even worse than not having had one?
There were fundamentally different needs in play, and I live with the fact that my mother wanted it that way, wanted to do that whole thing, and she felt it was necessary, and I can accept that. It's probably a bigger loss for her than it is for me.
Mm-hmm.
But in my own case, to me, I already know who he is and what he means. And I don't need to try to, in a way that is doomed to fail, concretize it. And in my father's family, there had been debates going back generations about, do you just get cremated and have the ashes distributed by the intimate family members at some point, or do you get buried in a plot? And
that's a separate issue from whether or not to have a service of some kind or not.
Yeah. The thing about the ashes thing is that it tends to produce a completely different sequence of steps, because it becomes something that the intimate family possesses, and then they decide what to do with that. and whether to organize something formal or to just at some point take it somewhere and do something with it informally. These become questions. When you buy a plot of land and bury somebody in the ground, and then everybody has to come out and there has to be a whole to-do, and you have to put up a bunch of money, and there's a burdening of the future that comes from the reserving of land for a purpose like this. And because of immediate emotional needs in that moment, enormous burdens are taken on that have long-standing effects, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of land use. These are some of the different things that came up over the years in our debates and discussions about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we could go into the weeds on this, and
yeah,
I'll just say my own personal case, my father was cremated. His ashes were there at the memorial and at the funeral home. It was not a very large expense, and now we will distribute those ashes, as we come up with it later. But there was a memorial. There was a time where the community came together and people spoke about him. Who, it was an open mic, and so, and I felt that was a good thing to have done at the time, but I'm not.
Some people certainly benefit from it, and it's a small thing for me to put up with it so that other people can have it. And I don't mind having put up with it so that other people can have it. I often in my life have a strong desire to not concretize things that I think can't be concretized. Don't make an image of something that you can't make an image of.
Let's shift over briefly for a few minutes onto the Hemingway, because I wonder if by not concretizing things that we end up with nothing, which is what this story is obsessing about. The not only the way in which the prospect of death erases meaning and significance from a life, but also life itself seems to be reduced to ways to defend against hopelessness. In the story, a clean, well-lighted place is simply a kind of, literally it's kind of an anesthetic against the feeling of despair that runs through the story. What do you think, Nina and Benjamin, of the Hemingway story of Clean, Well-Lighted Place? Is it redeemable? Is it just a prideful exploration of themes of nihilism? What do you guys think of it? Nina?
No, I don't know if prideful is the best way to think about anything in a way. I just see everything as an effort, or I'm glad that things exist and don't exist, right? So it's lovely to read short stories, and whether they succeed on their own terms or not, I don't know. I think that's the interesting aesthetic question. I suppose. Yeah, is it the presentation of these two different attitudes? I suppose, the kind of the acceptance, perhaps. Acceptance is an interesting one. I don't think the West, because the West has typically been very agentic, right? It's obsessed with doing things. It's not really obsessed with accepting things, right? It's very opposed to this idea of acceptance in many ways, and I suppose the idea of acceptance can seem perhaps indifferent or even cold to an attitude that would see this quest for meaning as the most important thing, right? How can you just accept death? How can you just accept these things, right? So I think it's a very brief story, right? But I think some of the best short stories are like this. They're like little points, little pricks into your thinking on this issue. I'm not sure what to think about it. What did he fear? It was not a fear or dread. It was a nothing that he knew too well. It's like the nothing, the nihilism, the zero, although the naught and the zero are not the same actually, but embracing the nothing. Like you can either say everything is meaningless and this is interesting and great, or you can say everything is meaningless, like it's all terrible, right? It doesn't tell you, again, I'm making the same point, but it doesn't tell you how to respond to this question.
Well, the pragmatic advice is to find either a wife to go home to or a clean, well-lighted place where you can have moments of peace that are properly fashioned, I suppose. But Ben, what did you make of the Hemingway?
Hemingway's fate makes it a little bit hard to take his advice.
Yeah.
I found also my mind going back to Antigone a little bit, because when we read Antigone in high school, we were popcorn reading, and I always read for Creon. And I sympathized a lot with Creon in that play. I did.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Well, and just to clarify, Creon was on the side of the city and civic order and the law, public law. And
there were reasons not to do this.
Right.
The heart has its reasons that reason cannot know, surely.
All right. Well, listen, thank you guys for joining me in this reflection on the denial of death. I will see you guys, or at least Ben, next week, and we can return to talking about politics proper. But I thought this was an interesting conversation. I'm going to wrap it up here. And
love to all the people out there worrying about the snap.
Right. All right. I'm going to end it with the intro, or the outro, the same as the intro. Here it is.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around